Hi, everyone. Welcome to Software Monetization Matters. This is a series of fireside chats where we sit down with thought leaders to talk about all things to do with software monetization. In today's chat, I get the lucky seat because I get to talk to one of our customers. Firstly, a quick intro of myself. My name is Darren Ramatala. I'm a senior product manager here at Thales. With me today is Brian Kelly, who is responsible for the product lines at Cloudnine. The theme of today's chat is around licensing and protection, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Brian's thoughts and insights in this area. But before we get into that, Brian, would you like to give us an intro of yourself and of the solutions at Cloud9?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Brian Kelly here. I'm the VP of products at Cloudnine. I've been with Cloudnine for about 10 years, going on 11. So I've, moved through the life cycle of our, application, from a sales engineer role up into our VP of products area. Just a little bit about Cloudnine. We are a e-discovery provider. We provide both on-premise and SaaS deployment options to assist both legal departments and investigative departments the ability to review emails, text messages, Slack communications, loose, records, and other content that may be pertinent for those litigations, compliance, or investigation workflows that they're dealing with. And our customer base, as you'll hear in this call, stretches from the government down to, small, corp, large law, all the way down to small law, and almost everywhere in between, just because of, I always like to say litigation, basically doesn't care what industry you're in, it'll happen to anyone.
Exactly. That's when you talk about the kind of confidentiality of stuff, right? We often talk about software protection and protecting software from revenue leakage, from bad guys, from accidental piracy, right? All of that kind of stuff. But I think in your case, what's interesting to me is that it talks about the sort of linking the software into the protection of essentially client confidentiality, right? Client data. This is a super sensitive area, right? From a client confidentiality perspective. Could you kind of help me form that bridge between the two a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously with litigation, I mean, we're involved in some, matters that are very complex, very contentious, and also, very confidential. We have a very large deployment in, with the DOJ and a lot of other government entities. And for some of those matters, I mean, they're truly in rooms with no internet connectivity, running our software on a, fixed desktop or, server location, and basically almost like a ready room, right? And so for those type of, deployments, it's really important that the licensing is locked down so that no one could come in there and access that information and spin up some type of version of our software to then access that kind of data. Secondarily, we have clients that basically have deployments across the countries. We work with a lot of very large law firms, and what they want is they want to have one centralized licensing network, but within that process, they want to have and empower their local sites and offices the ability to check out those licenses from a centralized location and actually run that data on-prem. Because with e-discovery, you're typically talking about terabytes of data that you're trying to parse through, and it's not always feasible to push that up to a centralized processing location. It's important for those local, offices, whether that's, something like, your actual licensing centers in, DC, but you're running your job in Dallas, you want to be able to check out those licenses and access that information across the geographic locations of, the United States or even abroad in some cases.
That storage of that licensed data, right? I think we assume we're talking about licensed servers here, right? Are they ones that you guys are hosting yourself at Cloud9, or do the customers kind of take responsibility for looking after those themselves?
Yeah, so we do use the SaaS version here of Thales. So what our clients do is they do a check-in process. The way we, depending on our client, we'll either do like a month check-in process, a year check-in process, or some other range of that process. And so the way it works is they go out there and they validate their license. It'll set up that license to work without connectivity for a set amount of time. like I
Okay.
said, either a month or a year.
Yeah.
And so that way they're not always having to constantly check in with us. What ends up happening though is sometimes we have organizations that do utilize the same licenses, but they bundle it across a bunch of different deployments. So they may have, and I'll just make up some, examples, 100 licenses for their organization, but each of their offices may have like 20 licenses associated.
Yeah.
And one
Right.
office gets in a situation where they're like, hey, I need a lot more power this month, right? And they say, can I borrow your license, in Omaha, right? And so the Omaha office can actually utilize a check-in and check-out process that Thales, helps us with, so that they can actually send that content to us, or so the client doesn't have to actually interact with us. They can check out those licenses, they can reestablish that connection in the basically the Omaha office, and all of a sudden they're running 40 licenses for whatever time period they need to choose.
Right. It's like concurrent licenses or floating licenses, but across the whole world, ultimately, right? Across the internet, right?
Correct. As long as it's just
Yeah.
a license key. So you can, I mean,
Yeah.
if you really wanted to, you could give it to an end customer if you were a law firm or something like that. And we sometimes have some clients that do that. They need to process data on-prem at a client office. They can actually utilize their licensing. They obviously have to bring and install the software that we provide, but they can use those licensing as they need.
Yeah. One of the things, we often hear like benefits of having doing exactly what you guys have done, which is a fairly recent approach, right, of moving the license control into the cloud ultimately, right, and putting it into the into a location where everyone can access it. Gives you exactly what you talked about, right? This ability to share licenses across multiple sites, right, that may have no connectivity with each other, right? Often, right? They may just have connectivity to the outside world, right? And we've
Mhm.
really seen that. Another thing that we've seen is this ability to have a much more kind of direct level of control over the licenses. Instant uh, instant deployment of new licenses, the ability to bring licenses back. Is that something that you guys have also leveraged as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we leverage that on our own end. Obviously, I mean, for us, the generation process is really important, and it's something that any customer that's going to utilize your product is going to need that ability to easily generate licenses, issues those to a customer, so that they can actually take actions on those and then start that install process.
Yep.
We also have situations where sometimes customers are unfortunately just behind, and we will disable and utilize that kind of process to reclaim those licenses.
Hmm.
Where we may be a little bit unique is we also issue this process to our clients. We have a reclaim process that exists there. So if you do check out, going back to my scenario where you're running a couple of different license, or basically deployment site, but shared licensing, we do have the ability to reclaim those temp license keys that we generate, so
Yep.
that
Yep.
if you put it in the Omaha office and you're just not able to get a hold of them and you need to reclaim that license, you can issue that reclaim process on your localized piece, so that you can pull back those 20 additional licenses that you may have provided in a temp fashion and bring those back to your DC office where you might be controlling that
Right.
process. And that's something that our customers are able to leverage without really involving us in any meaningful way. And sometimes it may be we're given temp license in that process and we're doing that reclaim process, but for the most part, it's a lot of times utilized by our customers.
Right. Right. Exactly. This question's probably a bit of a reach, actually, but I mean, uh, is this something that helps to kind of reinforce any kind of legal compliance requirement, having this direct ability to turn off features more specifically and essentially blacklist stuff, or is it really about just kind of convenience for the customers?
It's not in itself part of the compliance side of it. Where it's important is obviously that control aspect where there is compliances, and some of that is the access of who can see and validate specific information.
Right.
So the licensing issue process may be important because you can centralize a deployment and allow only those specified users who have access to that machine
Yeah.
to work with the product. The licensing itself is not really reaching past the compliance side for what we're aware of. Our
Yeah.
customers are
Yeah.
definitely doing some
Right.
stuff that we are not even privy to a lot of times as well.
Right. Right. Yeah. Sure. Exactly. Exactly. Um, You talked about having some sort of offline use cases as well. I mean, what kind
Mhm.
of ratio typically is it between sort of connected deployments and the offline customers who for whatever reason can't really leverage connectivity?
Yeah, most of our customers are not, not that, concerned about the connectivity process within
Hmm.
that, workstation. But we do have some very, very large deployments of our software that is really important. I mean, the government is a very good example, but we
Right.
have some private organizations that have similar requirements. For example, with some of our government deployments, they typically have kind of two environments. They have their online environment where they're actually utilizing, and they have web connectivity and they're able to check in and check out licenses with a very simplified process. Whereas they also have, as I mentioned, some of these licenses that are dedicated to these environments that really have no connectivity to the outside world. And for them, the important piece of that is they still want it to be, easy to access, easy to set up those
Right.
licenses. And previously, how we
Exactly.
accomplished that was like a dongle system. We would have,
Yeah.
little flash keys, and you have to keep track of it. Customers inevitably lose them, or they, we have to issue temp licenses, so we've got to send them something, and then they never send it
Yeah.
back. So we've got to charge them a couple
Right.
$100 to, make up
Leaving
for
money on
our
the table,
losses.
right? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So the nice thing about, this process is we have a much cleaner workflow, right? And it's a lot easier to issue those licenses, even for the non-connected environments. We don't have to rely on those dongles, in today's world.
Hmm.
We're still able to support those dongles that we have out there for, some of our older licensing models, with some of our workflows that we have today. But it's not, it's definitely not something we're issuing, and customers like it because they also don't want to have to manage that, right? Because now
Right.
your management team is relying on someone to remember to keep track of that flash drive or not accidentally throw a flash drive away because they're like, what is
Yeah.
this? I don't need it.
Yeah. Right. Right. Exactly.
So it's a
I've even
big
heard of
benefit.
some government, especially some government offices, where they actually glue up the USB ports. Right. They don't even want anything plugged in. So it's
Tape them.
like,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, sometimes we have to, when we would have dongles, a lot of times they had to get specific exceptions to, or they had to add USB ports because they don't have
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
default on some of these laptops. Because the problem with the USB, especially in these confidential cases, it's something you can plug in and you can walk away with data, and they want to prevent that. So that's another
Exactly.
challenge with the dongle system as well,
Yeah.
where you can do inputs, but you can't do outputs and stuff like that.
Yeah. 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 It's the ultimate offline convenience, but often often
It,
even that is not
it,
enough, right, for some deployments, right?
Correct, and it's a
Uh,
pain. So having this ability to both deploy with the Thales
yeah.
software in a connectivity landscape, or offline, with something where they're like, hey, we don't need access to the machine. We need, you here's the license that you'll utilize for those, those devices, and we set a hard deadline, and it basically works for them until they need to check back in with us.
Yeah. Did you do you find that like you might have obviously you're going to have a subset of customers who connectivity is just no, right? A lot of the government
Mhm.
buildings and places like that. But have you had any kind of like customers that are more, it's you could maybe better describe it as connection hesitancy, right? There's a little bit of nervousness about having kind of using a control system, a license control system that was out in the internet. Was that, and if did you need to have, was there anything that you guys could manage to do to help convince them that it wasn't, that their concerns were maybe not so valid?
Yeah, I mean, we've felt that for a long time because
Mm,
obviously some of the other things that are doing check-ins and updates and stuff like that for our software require some of those to, really run, the most efficient workflows possible. So you're always getting that piece. A lot of times it's an education process, right? It's,
right, right,
it's making them
exactly.
understand some of the limitations that they're putting on themselves when they limit those connectivities, and do those limitations, counteract the, the benefit that they're actually getting to that process. What we typically find is most customers really are not as hesitant anymore, to utilize some type of SaaS-based licensing, connectivity process. And the thing that we make nice about it is you only have to do that connectivity when you're doing those check-ins. So we don't require while you're running the software to require those connectivities. It's only during that check-in or issuance process that it really requires that licensing to be set up. So that
Right,
gives
right.
customers a little bit of certainty, says, hey, we're reducing our chance of it, and we're also only requiring it on that licensing server itself. So the nice
Yeah,
thing is
yeah,
you can run our software without connectivity at all, and it can be a server that sits somewhere else with no connectivity. As long as it has that intra connectivity to that server, you do have the
exactly.
ability at that point to designate and access that
Yeah,
information.
yeah. Awesome. Cool. Okay. Um, could you tell us a little bit about like the the customer experience aspect, right? I mean, these it's obviously, you're I guess the products themselves are managed by IT, which takes away that sort of overhead of kind of, especially for the true offline cases where you
Mhm.
don't have that sort of more automation that you can benefit from. Did you have some challenges around protecting the customer experience with those offline cases, and what did you do to sort of overcome those?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to our support team. Obviously that's really who kind of makes this run, both our
Sure,
sales op
right,
and our support team. Our sales ops obviously generates those licenses for them, but our support team is really who works with the customer to get those install processes. It's even when they work with our support team, I mean, it's typically a very, straightforward walkthrough workflow for
hmm
most of those customers when they're doing those offline deployments. Um, it's a pretty simple process. We have a little toolkit that we provide them. It runs just this application that basically does some detection, sets up the licensing file, sets the expiration date for
right,
it, and then they really only have to check in with us when those licenses expire. What we
right,
do from a sales ops is we keep up with that as well, so we always issue those new licenses. And a lot of times, once they install it with our support team once, they really don't have to reach back out to us. As long as they're still running the same version and all that kind of stuff of our software, they're able to update their license, whether it's a monthly or a yearly check-in, depending on their contract. And they can come in there and, isolate that information pretty quickly. When we talk about the SaaS approach, we don't even really ever have support calls around,
right.
actually setting up the license. We provide them, basically the key. They plug in the key into their what we call our
Yeah,
license manager, and boom, it's done. Right,
yeah,
the reclaim process
right.
is nice and easy. The issuing those temp license from a centralized licensing server is very easy. So we don't see a lot of a lot of support calls, and that's really a shout out to both our development team and then just Thales's software from the back end from the licensing management standpoint. It makes it easy for our sales ops and our
Right.
clients to both issue and fulfill those processes.
Like taking a SaaS approach to licensing gives you that low touch experience of SaaS, right? With in conjunction with licensing, right?
Yeah, we don't have any IT, requirements to
Yeah,
manage it, right? Our sales ops team isn't hitting up our IT because we
yeah,
have a, server go down or we're having our own internal connectivity problems. We feel very confident that, Thales is keeping those up and running. And to this point, we've never had any issues with the SaaS being able to connect and issue a license, from
right.
it today. So, you
Yeah,
know, that uptime's been, incredible.
yeah. As you say, it tends to be just whilst you need to check it, whilst you need to update it, whilst you need to change something. It's usually just it's not a continual, dependency and stuff like that, is it? It tends to be.
Correct. Yeah. Once you check out the license for the, basically that process, it's good until you basically check it back in or
Yeah,
you
right.
reissue it. So we understand that because not that, we expect it to go down, but there is reasons like customers will turn off, they'll disconnect from a licensing server or they'll do
Mm-hmm.
something internally because they're processing something really heavy, right? Some really large data volumes that they need to get through so
Yep.
that they can review,
Yep.
hundreds of, thousands of records in a and process that data within a few hours. And so it's important that we disconnect the usage of our software from the actual claiming process. Now,
Yeah.
there's still the situation where they want to pull those licenses back, and it's important that those connectivities are, established for those reasons as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Awesome. So one last question. Um, where going back, talk about Cloud9 from a strategic perspective. Where do you see yourselves going in that? I mean, everyone's talking like stuff like AI, right? It's pretty much table stakes these days. What does the future look like for you, and how does that impact your kind of software monetization strategy going forwards?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for us, it's actually been a really exciting into June and early July. We actually had a very large release on both of our, kind of our key products. So we have both a SaaS application and an on-prem application. Our on-prem tool is called Law. It's the one that mostly utilizes, the licensing server that we're talking
hmm
about today. It had a very large update, and it's got it was actually some upgrades to the licensing that we talked about today, plus a lot of other really key features that our customers are looking for to help them with the e-discovery processing side.
Yep.
For that product, we're continuing to add and improve performance. So we have a big focus this year on increasing throughput by improving what we call our turbo import
Yep.
workflow. so that you can, when you get a terabyte of data that you need to review very quickly, you're not waiting on the review to start. You're able to start reviewing, really quickly. And that's
Oh,
what our
yeah, right.
software helps.
Yeah, yeah.
And then for our SaaS application, the big thing for us this year is we actually just released, we merged a product or two of our products together. And these products help with the review of documents. So the actual, looking through and tagging and organizing content for litigation. What we added this year is we had an award-winning software. There's an industry, conference called LegalTech, and we were excited to win, basically, the innovative award for,
Wow.
this year around what we do for modern data. And when we talk about modern data, it's things like text messages and chats and,
Yeah.
Slack communications, Teams like we're on here. And it allows them to actually review in context of communication. So you can see an email followed by a text message and followed by,
Mm-hmm.
a Slack message that you may,
Yeah.
kind of move between. And we're really uniquely positioned in the market where none of our competitors are really doing anything in that area. That's really dramatic and kind of changes the review process. So we're really excited about that. We're continuing to work on improvements on that area, continuing to look at analytic options like AI and things like that to help improve those workflows while still just, helping with the, basics, the email, the e-doc and, Words, Excels and things like that for
Yeah.
review. So a really exciting year for us. Look forward to, had a good first half of the year. Look forward to the second half here as well.
So, Brian, thanks a lot for the time and for sharing your insights. I think there's some really, really interesting stuff there. And absolutely, congratulations on that award as well. Great stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. We were very excited about it and, look forward to a few more in the next coming years.
Great
Thank you
stuff.
for your time.
Thanks, Brian.